Snoop Dogg, the legendary rapper, finds himself in a shocking situation when a security guard at the airport refuses to let him board his own private jet. But what happens next? No one saw it coming. A twist so unexpected that it left everyone speechless and sparked a nationwide conversation. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop your location in the comments to join the discussion. Snoop stood on the balcony of his beachfront mansion, gazing at the city lights flickering against the endless ocean. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of success, a view that once felt like a dream but had now become his reality. Yet tonight, that view did little to calm the restless energy running through him. He was on the verge of a decision that felt bigger than anything he'd done before. Owning a private jet had always been a thought in the back of his mind, but not for the reasons people assumed. For most, a jet was a symbol of excess, a status symbol, a flex. But for Snoop, it was about something deeper. Freedom. The ability to move without limits, to reach people and places that commercial flights couldn't. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about purpose. The idea had hit him hard on a recent trip to a struggling school deep in the heartland. Performing for kids who had so little yet carried so much hope reminded him of his own childhood, big dreams, few opportunities. Sitting in the cramped seat of a commercial flight on the way back, the thought kept nagging at him. What if he had the means to do more? To visit more schools, more communities, to make real change? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Jax, his longtime manager and close friend. "Snoop, you there?" "Yeah, just thinking." "About the jet, right?" "I know that tone." Snoop exhaled, staring at the waves below. "I think I'm doing it." "Look, I respect that. But you gotta be sure, man. This is a big move, and you know people are gonna talk." Snoop leaned on the railing, letting the breeze cool his thoughts. He knew exactly what Jax meant. Success didn't shield him from scrutiny. Every step he took was analyzed, criticized. But this wasn't about the headlines. "Let him talk," Snoop said finally. "They'll see what this jet is really about." Jax chuckled. "That's what I wanted to hear. Let's make it happen." From that moment, the journey began. Snoop threw himself into the process, learning about engines, fuel efficiency, cabin layouts, things he never thought he'd care about. Every visit to a hangar, every conversation with designers, fueled his excitement. He wasn't just buying a plane. He was building a tool for impact. When he finally chose the perfect model, spacious, high-tech, capable of reaching the most remote corners, he felt a rush of pride. The day he signed the papers, he knew this was the beginning of something bigger than himself. Stepping onto the jet for the first time was surreal. Polished wood, soft leather, panoramic windows framing the endless sky. But it wasn't the luxury that got him hyped, it was the vision. The lives he'd touch, the places he'd go, the legacy he was about to build. And then came the first flight, a journey set to redefine everything. But what happened next? No one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Snoop Dogg stood in his living room, staring at a framed photo of his younger self, a lanky teenager gripping an oversized microphone, eyes burning with ambition. A quiet smile played on his lips as a wave of gratitude washed over him. "You've come a long way," he murmured. "But the work's just beginning." Tomorrow, he would take to the skies, not just as a symbol of success, but as proof of what was possible. What he didn't know was that his first flight would bring a challenge he never saw coming, a moment that would test his resolve and redefine his mission in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning of Snoop's inaugural flight was picture perfect, clear skies, a warm breeze, and a feeling of endless possibilities. As his car rolled through the gates of the private airstrip, he leaned back, savoring the moment. This was more than just a flight. It was the beginning of something bigger. The jet gleamed under the morning sun, a sleek masterpiece of engineering and vision. It wasn't just a plane, it was a statement, a tool for impact, a new chapter in his legacy. Technicians moved efficiently around the aircraft, preparing for departure. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass mixed with a faint hint of aviation fuel, a scent that now symbolized the future. Adjusting his tailored blazer, Snoop walked toward the jet, confidence in every step. This wasn't just about him, it was for everyone who had ever dared to dream bigger than their circumstances. And then, a voice cut through the comm. "Hey, you! Hold it right there." Snoop turned, brow furrowing. A security guard was approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, but his expression anything but friendly. "Can I help you?" Snoop asked, keeping his tone cool. The guard's eyes narrowed as he gave Snoop a slow, deliberate once-over. "This is a private airstrip. You're not supposed to be here." Snoop tilted his head slightly, caught off guard by the man's tone. "I know. I'm here for my flight." He gestured toward the jet. "That's my plane." The guard let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Your plane? That's funny. Now let's see some ID." Snoop's patience was already wearing thin, but he reached into his pocket, pulling out his license and laminated proof of ownership. The guard snatched them, scanning the documents with suspicion. His eyes flicked back to Snoop, his expression twisting into something ugly. "How exactly did you afford a plane like this?" Snoop's jaw tightened. He dealt with this kind of thing before, but it never stopped stinging. He met the guard's gaze and answered evenly, "I worked for it." He reached for his documents, but the guard didn't hand them back. Instead, he stepped closer, voice low but laced with hostility. "Look, buddy. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I've seen this before. You don't belong here." The accusation hit like a slap. Snoop squared his shoulders, towering over the man. His voice stayed calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but this isn't a scam. I own that plane. And I have every right to be here." The guard crossed his arms. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the police." Before Snoop could respond, the guard stepped away, grabbing his radio. Within minutes, sirens cut through the peaceful morning. 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing, for officers stepping out. The guard rushed to meet them, animatedly gesturing in Snoop's direction. Snoop took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He watched as the officers listened to the guard's version of events, their expressions shifting from neutral to skeptical. Finally, one turned toward him. "Sir, we're going to need to see your identification and proof of ownership for the aircraft." The officer's tone was firm, but not dripping with the same hostility as the guard's. Snoop handed over the documents again, keeping his movements measured. The officer studied them carefully but didn't relax. "These look legitimate," he admitted. "But we still need to verify everything. You understand?" Snoop nodded, but his patience was razor thin. "I understand. But this is unnecessary. Everything you need is right there." The verification process dragged on. Calls were made, documents cross-checked. Snoop stood by his jet, arms crossed, watching as the guard hovered nearby, a smug smirk on his face. The triumphant feeling he'd had this morning? Gone. Replaced by something heavier, anger, disbelief, exhaustion. The crew had stepped back, giving the scene space, their curiosity tinged with unease. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration. Instead, it was turning into a spectacle. And what happened next? No one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The tension in the air was thick. The security guard stood firm, arms crossed, a smug satisfaction plastered across his face as the police continued their so-called verification. Snoop could feel the weight of the stares from the flight crew, the silent judgment, the disbelief. Minutes turned to nearly an hour. He had been here before. Different places, different faces, but the same story. Dismissed. Underestimated. Judged before he even had a chance to speak. He had thought he left those days behind, but here they were again, staring him right in the face. Finally, an officer walked up, holding his documents. Everything checks out. You're free to go. Snoop took the papers, his jaw tight. That's it? No apology? No acknowledgement that you just wasted my time assuming I didn't belong here? The officer hesitated, but before he could respond, the guard cut in with a shrug. Look, we were just doing our job. You should be glad we're thorough. Snoop's patience snapped. Thorough? His voice was calm, but the fire was there. This wasn't thorough. This was profiling. Plain and simple. And you know it. The guard's smirk faltered, but he said nothing. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before turning back to their cars. As the sirens faded into the distance, Snoop turned toward his jet, but the excitement, the pride, was gone. The moment that should have been a milestone now felt tainted. As he stepped aboard, his mind wasn't on the luxury, the success, or even the journey ahead. It was locked on one thought: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The engines roared as the jet lifted off the tarmac, but the usual thrill of flight wasn't there. The city of Skyview shrank beneath him, roads and fields blending into the horizon, but his mind was still stuck on the confrontation. He gripped the armrest, the memory of the guard's smirk burning in his mind. You don't belong here. The words echoed over and over. It wasn't just about this one moment. It was about something bigger. No matter how far he had come, how much he had achieved, there were still people who looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. He let out a slow, frustrated breath and leaned back in his seat. Across the cabin, Jax, his manager and longtime friend, studied him for a moment before speaking. Snoop, you good? Snoop forced a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm good. Jax wasn't buying it. You don't look good. That was a lot back there. Snoop's smile faded. He looked down at his hands, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. Yeah. His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. It was. Jack set his tablet aside, leaning forward. You don't have to hold it all in, man. What happened back there wasn't right. Anyone could see that. Snoop nodded, but the sting of it all still sat deep. It's not the first time. His voice was lower now. You'd think I'd be used to it by now. Jack shook his head. But you shouldn't have to be. His tone was firm, unwavering. You worked hard for everything you have. You earned that plane, just like you earned your success. No one has the right to question that. His words hit, but they didn't ease the conflict brewing inside. Snoop had always believed in proving himself through action. Let the work speak louder than the hate. But this time felt different. This time, the humiliation cut deeper. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, his mind drifted, not to the future, but to the past. He was 8 years old, sitting in a crowded classroom. It was career day, and each student had to share their dreams for the future. When his turn came, he stood up, heart pounding but voice steady. I'm gonna be a big-time rapper. The room erupted in laughter. His classmates snickered. Even the teacher smiled and said, "That's a nice dream, but maybe you should think of something more realistic." That moment never left him. It wasn't just the laughter. It was the message behind it. That he wasn't enough. That his dreams were too big for someone like him. And now, decades later, standing on top of the world, they were still laughing. Still doubting. Still trying to tell him where he didn't belong. Jax's voice pulled him back to the present. Snoop, what are you gonna do about it? Snoop looked out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly before him. He didn't answer right away. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't over. And when he landed, the world was about to find out exactly why. Snoop looked up, Jax's question catching him off guard. Do about what? Jax's expression was serious. About what happened. About the way they treated you. Are you just gonna let it go? For a moment, Snoop hesitated. His first instinct was to brush it off, to focus on the positive, to move forward like he always had. But the longer he sat with it, the more he realized ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "I don't know yet," he admitted finally, his voice low but steady. "But I can't let it slide. Not this time." Jax nodded, thoughtful. "Maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe you can turn this into a statement, show people that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable." His words planted a seed. As the jet soared through the clouds, Snoop's frustration started shifting into something else, resolve. The flight ended without incident, but the morning's events still hung over him like a shadow. Stepping off the jet, he was met with a group of local organizers in Riverton. Their warm smiles and firm handshakes were a stark contrast to the hostility he had faced just hours earlier. For a moment, he felt hope again. One of the organizers, a woman named Clara, led him toward a group of kids who had gathered to meet him. Their faces lit up the moment they saw him, eyes wide with excitement. Snoop knelt down, listening to their dreams, their ambitions. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did. But even as he laughed and talked with the kids, the guard's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here." The injustice gnawed at him. It refused to be ignored. As he climbed into the car that would take him to his next destination, he pulled out his phone. He hesitated for a moment, then hit record. Looking straight into the camera, his voice was steady, but the weight of what he felt was undeniable. Today was supposed to be a celebration. The first flight in my new jet, a symbol of everything I've worked for. But instead, I was met with suspicion, hostility, doubt. Not because I did anything wrong, but because of who I am. Because of how I look. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that still judges people by the color of their skin, no matter how far they've come. And I know I'm not the only one who's been through this. His eyes locked on the camera. We need to have these conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. We need to demand better. A pause. Then, a promise. This isn't over. I'm going to make sure something good comes out of this. For me. For you. For all of us. He hit upload. The moment the video started spreading, he felt something shift. The humiliation, the anger, it was still there. But now, it wasn't just emotion. It was fuel. A catalyst for something bigger. By the time Snoop reached his hotel, his phone was on fire. Notifications flooded in, comments, shares, messages of support. Jax, who had been tracking the video's reach, met him in the lobby, his face a mix of amazement and urgency. "Snoop." He held up his tablet. "You're trending. And I don't mean just a little. This thing is blowing up." Snoop raised an eyebrow, taking the tablet from Jax's hands. 500,000 views. In just 2 hours. The numbers were climbing fast. Social media was ablaze, the hashtags #FlyingWhileBlack and #SnoopSpeaksOut leading the charge. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people were weighing in, sharing their own experiences, rallying behind his message. The comments were a storm of emotions. "This is disgusting. How does this still happen? Snoop, you're an inspiration. Thank you for speaking out. Every time I think we've made progress, something like this reminds me we haven't. We need to do better." But not everyone was supportive. The usual detractors made their voices heard. Here we go again. Playing the victim card. Maybe if you acted like you belonged there, this wouldn't have happened. Typical celebrity drama. Must be exaggerating for attention. Snoop had expected this. He knew that speaking out always came with backlash. But as he scrolled through the thousands of responses, one thing was clear: this was bigger than him now. And no matter what the haters had to say, he wasn't backing down. Snoop scrolled through the comments, his eyes catching the usual negativity, accusations, dismissals, the same tired rhetoric. Here we go again. Playing the victim. Maybe if you acted like you belonged, this wouldn't have happened. For a second, he felt that familiar flicker of anger. But he let it pass. He didn't post that video for the trolls. He posted it for the people who understood. For the ones who had been through it themselves. For the ones who needed to see that they weren't alone. And it was working. By the evening, news outlets had picked up the story. Interview requests flooded in. Jack sat across from him in the hotel lounge, phone in hand, juggling his rapidly filling schedule. BCN News wants a live interview tomorrow morning, he said, scrolling. Eagle Times is asking for a written statement. And Lena Montague's team reached out, they want you on her show. Snoop ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. The weight of it all was settling on his shoulders. This is bigger than I expected, he admitted. Jax nodded. That's because it's not just about you. You opened a door a lot of people have been waiting to walk through. That thought stayed with him that night. Lying in bed, he found himself replaying old memories. The subtle and blatant moments of discrimination that had left their mark over the years. The people who never had the chance to share their stories. And the question that wouldn't leave his mind, what could he do to make a real difference? The next morning, he stepped into the spotlight with a renewed sense of purpose. The BCN News interview was his first public statement since the video went viral. Sitting across from the host, studio lights casting a warm glow, he spoke candidly. This isn't just about me, he said, his deep voice steadied but charged with emotion. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to persist. I'm speaking out because I have the platform to do so. But there are so many people who face this every single day and don't have a voice. That's who I'm doing this for. The interview was raw, honest, powerful, and it only added fuel to the fire. By the end of the day, the story had gone global. Discussions about race, privilege, and systemic bias dominated social media, talk shows, and news segments. Messages flooded in, stories from people who had faced their own battles with discrimination. One message in particular stuck with him. It was from Marcus, a young baggage handler at a small airport in Eagle Land. He wrote about being passed over for promotions despite his dedication. About how his supervisors always assumed he wasn't management material. Seeing you speak out gave me hope, Marcus wrote. Snoop read the message twice, his chest tightening. Marcus' story was just one of thousands. But it drove the point home, this wasn't just about exposing injustice. It was about empowering people to believe in their worth, to fight for their place in a world that constantly tried to push them down. As the movement grew, activists and organizations reached out. People wanted action, not just conversation. Ideas were shared. Plans started forming. Snoop saw a clear path forward, not just speaking out, but creating real, lasting change. But, as expected, not everyone was ready for it. The management of the private airstrip where the incident occurred released a statement, a careful mix of apology and deflection. We regret any misunderstanding, it read, but our security personnel were simply following protocol. Snoop wasn't surprised. But he was done letting things slide. Statements wouldn't fix the problem. Surface-level apologies wouldn't create change. Accountability would. Action would. By the end of the week, the movement had turned into a rallying cry. Protests were organized. Petitions circulated. Discussions on bias and inequality took center stage in media and public forums. And Snoop? He was already laying the groundwork for his next move. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing plans for a new initiative to support marginalized communities, Jax walked in, holding up his phone with a knowing smile. You're not gonna believe this. Snoop looked up. The airstrip just announced they're launching mandatory bias training for all staff. Jax paused, then added, and the guard? He's been fired. For a moment, Snoop just stared at him. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. He nodded. Good. Then, after a beat, his voice firm, but we're just getting started. Because what began as a moment of humiliation and anger had now transformed into something much, much bigger. And this was only the beginning. Snoop's encounter with discrimination at the private airstrip had sparked something far bigger than he had ever imagined. What began as a frustrating moment of injustice had transformed into Wings of Hope, a movement dedicated to helping those in need through aviation. After the airstrip announced mandatory bias training and fired the guard, Snoop knew the real work was just beginning. Public support poured in, and the national conversation about systemic prejudice intensified. He realized that speaking out was only the first step. Action was what truly mattered. Sitting in his office, reviewing countless messages from supporters, he confided in Jax. Talking isn't enough. I want to be part of the solution. Jax smiled knowingly and slid a folder across the table. Inside were plans for Wings of Hope, a program that would use Snoop's private jet not just for business, but for good, providing free flights for medical patients, reuniting families in crisis, and supporting students with educational opportunities. Snoop was all in. This is it. Over the next few weeks, the initiative took off, literally. The first mission was transporting Maya, a 7-year-old girl with a rare heart condition, to a hospital in Skyview. Her family couldn't afford the trip, but Snoop's team stepped in. The emotional moment when her mother tearfully thanked him only reinforced his mission. You don't have to repay me, Snoop reassured her. This is what it's all about. The movement grew rapidly. Flights carried aid to disaster zones, transported supplies, and gave underserved students life-changing experiences in the air. One night, Snoop hosted a group of high schoolers on his jet, transforming it into a classroom in the sky. They dined, dreamed, and listened to inspiring stories from mentors in various fields. One student, Malik, shyly admitted his dream of becoming a pilot, then doubted if it was possible. Snoop crouched down, looking him in the eye. I don't think you can. Malik's face fell until Snoop grinned. I know you can. But you have to believe it first. That dinner was just the beginning. Soon, scholarships, mentorships, and training programs followed. As Wings of Hope continued to change lives, Snoop's impact became undeniable. News outlets covered the program, donations poured in, and major organizations wanted to partner with him. The airstrip where it all began. They were forced to acknowledge their mistake. Then, one night, standing on the tarmac, watching another Wings of Hope flight take off, Jax approached with news. Mission number 54. In less than a year. Snoop watched the jet disappear into the sky, then turned to Jax. We're just getting started. And he meant it. What started as injustice had become a movement. Not just about fighting prejudice, but about lifting people up, creating opportunities, and proving that dreams have no limits.